On the 14th of December, 1944, Reuters reported in the New York Times, "A mysterious illuminated ball is the latest Nazi air warfare weapon. This means that towards the end of the Second World War, Germany was in possession of a secret weapon which displayed all the typical characteristics of a UFO." The first part of our puzzle took us to pre-First World War Vienna, where all sorts of esoteric, occult, and Sumerian ideas and material were circulating. Ideas which would later be taken up by the Third Reich, and with them the vision of a new and unconventional technology. It was a period which witnessed an enormous blossoming of various secret doctrines and orders: Templars and Rosicrucians, Illuminati and Freemasons, Anthroposophists, Theosophists, Neo-Templars and Armanen. Some of them seemed suddenly to have woken up after a centuries-long sleep. To this very day, the occult philosophy of the Third Reich is veiled under a thick cloud of mystery and secrecy. Its leaders were drawn from the ranks of the Thule Society and the SS. In many ways, their ideas differed significantly from the accepted National Socialist Party line. Their emblem was the black sun. A secret philosophy thousands of years old provided the foundation on which the occult practitioners of the Third Reich would later build. The black sun symbol can be found in many Babylonian and Assyrian places of worship. Even the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians knew of the symbol and the beliefs that it represented. The Babylonian and Assyrian civilizations often depicted the black sun in the form of a cross. Assyrian kings wore an insignia which in no way differed from the one more commonly known as the German Knight's Cross. This means the origin of this cross is many thousands of years older than Christianity. Victor Schauberger's experimental flying prototypes worked on the principle of levitation. Esoteric knowledge played an ever-increasing role in the search for new sources of energy and motive power. Such research as there was particularly important in the development of electrogravitational and tachometric propulsion. This seemed to be at the very core of the alternative technology, the energy source of the future, cheap, clean, and independent of raw materials. Two special departments, U-13 and SSE-4, were set up to concentrate exclusively on the realization of this new technology. The Socialist Party came to power, the occult societies withdrew into the background. Within the SS, the Thule Society created a separate secret organization called the Black Sun. The Friel Society carried on much as before with its scientific research. According to reports, the Friel Society had by the middle of 1934 created its first experimental circular aircraft to be propelled with the anti-gravitational effect, the RFC-1. The men responsible for the design and construction were Dr. Schumann and an engineer from Bochum. Since 1929, the young Gertie Vogt had been responsible for running the Friel Society, and she made herself known to private investors who were prepared to invest in projects that carried an element of risk. The Friel and Thule societies were not alone in their vision of space travel in the Germany of those days. UFO, the German national film company, released a motion picture called The First Woman on the Moon. The first space rocket was then built by Werner von Braun and Hermann Oberth with UFO movie money. Many German scientists studied the possibility of traveling to the stars. Before the end of 1934, the Friel Society had built its first light aircraft. The RFC-2, round aircraft. It was fitted with an improved real propulsion system and, for the first time, magnetic impulse steering. It measured hardly more than 16 feet from end to end, but it worked. It already possessed two typical characteristics of UFOs: the optical blurring of the contours when accelerating, and the colored lights depending on the level of power applied: red, orange, yellow, green, white, blue, or violet. Despite its advanced flying capabilities, the RFC-2 remained virtually unnoticed by the political leadership of the time. The same fate was to befall the first jet-propelled aircraft 4 years later: the HE-138, the HE-176, and the HE-280. Only the SS showed a slight interest in the work of the Vril Society. Its own Black Sun formation had meanwhile set up Research Department 4, SSE-4 for short, which was responsible for coming up with alternative sources of energy. What is certain is that their aim was to make Germany independent of foreign crude oil imports. Nevertheless, stimulated by Victor Schauberger and the success of the latest Vril success, SSE-4 now began to construct its own light aircraft. Using Captain Hans Kohler's tachyometer converter as a basis, and appropriating many Vril components, they developed their own Thule Aero engine. Towards the end of 1938, they had constructed a small propeller-driven light aircraft, the RFC-4, with the express purpose of observing how disc-shaped objects behave in flight. By 1939, the SS had already built its RFC-5, the first long-distance aircraft measuring more than 65 feet, and with the mysterious name Haunebu-1. Under tight security, the Haunebu-1 made its maiden flight, in all probability, in August of 1939. Documents show that by 1941, the British had already found out about these top-secret SS experiments. In contrast to the simple Vril prototype, the Haunebu was a complicated proposition. However, because of the form of its power unit, it offered considerably more storage space. In 1939, Hitler made one of his biggest mistakes.
Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe vergolten.
What might have been meant to be a limited military action, the Polish campaign, led directly to the Second World War. Quite contrary to what we might imagine the situation to be in the perfectly organized National Socialist state, everyone did exactly as he pleased. The Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the industrial concerns all followed their own inclinations. Competition for armaments contracts became intense. As a result, alternative methods of propulsion found themselves in direct competition with their more conventional counterparts. A sort of compromise was achieved with experimental flying saucers like the RFC-7.
Wir haben Transporte gemacht, auch vom Kampfgeschwader 26. Und zwar haben wir Torpedo geholt von Kiel, Holtenau.
The 26th Fighter Squadron had been ordered to fly from Kiel to Norway in order to resupply the 30 Fighter Squadron, the Bamba Command. Udet passed this model onto the research establishment in Peenemünde, where tests were later carried out. Over and over again, I later heard reports from people who were working in Prague on the construction of flying discs, and progress in this field was actually being made. I also knew that Habermohl and Schreiber were in possession of my model and had begun work on its practical applications. After that, I drove into the hills just outside Prague, where the secret testing ground was supposed to have been located. I had my Leica A camera with me when suddenly I saw such a flying saucer. I was wounded at the time, so I know that it was November, December, although the test flight was not due to take place until the following February. Someone had made an unscheduled test flight, and this is what I saw coming toward me. It had no wings, absolutely none. I took a photo and wound on the film, but it was already directly over me. Then I took a second photo, and I could see that it was a flying gyroscope, a flying saucer.
eine Flugscheibe.
A small Vril RFC-2 had been in service as a reconnaissance aircraft since the end of 1940. This rare photograph shows an RFC-2 in the skies over the southern Atlantic on the way to a rendezvous with the auxiliary cruiser Atlantis in the waters of the Antarctic. Individual sightings of the first RFC-6 Haunebu-2 were also reported. In July 1941, work began on this Schriever-Habermohl flying gyroscope, a jet-propelled vertical takeoff light aircraft. By the end of 1942, the first practical tests could begin. However, there were serious design faults in the first prototype. The same year, Dr. Richard Miete began work on a turbine-driven light aircraft, the RFC-7T. This was to be discus and not saucer-shaped. The Italian scientist Giuseppe Belluzzo soon joined this project, followed shortly afterwards by Schriever and Habermohl. They worked together to produce a functional, reliable light aircraft. And so, on the 17th of April 1945, Richard Miete was able to report to Adolf Hitler, "Today, under my direction, and in the presence of 3 Luftwaffe officers, the V-7 was tested in the skies above the Baltic." The general characteristics and attainable performance of the aircraft were as follows. The V-7 was a supersonic helicopter fitted with 12 BMW 028 turbo aggregate engines. During the first test flight, it reached an altitude of 78,000 feet, and on the second, rose to 80,000 feet. The craft can in principle be powered by unconventional energy sources.
And colleague of the late American Naval Admiral Del Farney, who was instrumental in bringing many of the German scientists to the United States at the end of World War II. As many of you know, there was an executive order given by President Truman in August of 1945, August 15th, 45. And in March of 1946, the State Naval War Committee authorized the collection of German materials relating to experiments of high technology. The operation known as Paperclip was to bring sequestered German scientists privately to the United States in the hope that the Americans could begin a quick start, a catch-up in the areas of V1 and V2 testing. Clearly, the Germans were involved with the building of what many allies considered miracle weapon systems. And so I have had the opportunity of looking very carefully at the documents that detail 2 histories. One, the building of the first space city on planet Earth known as Peenemünde, and the bringing over of some of the best technical and scientific experts in the world, headed by Dr. Wernher von Braun, which led to the placing of man on the moon. And secondly, a closer look at the lesser-known development of what some experts will call the Feuerkugel, the fiery ball, or the disc-like hovercraft that the Germans were experimenting with during World War II, which was known to American intelligence and yet not really appreciated until the Germans began to cooperate with the Americans following World War II in a unified effort to advance mankind into space.
The Allies described the various German flashing flying aircraft that they saw as Foo Fighters, fireballs. The German name for the typical Foo Fighter, however, was Fliegende Schildkröte, flying tortoise, because of its resemblance to the tortoise shell on the ground. It had been developed by a specialist technical unit of the SS in the Vienna suburb of Wiener Neustadt. It was in fact an unmanned flying probe. Its mission was to fly close to enemy aircraft and wreak havoc on the electrical circuits. In addition, it was equipped with a special type of klystron tube. The SS spoke of death rays.
I was a fighter pilot in World War II. I served a career of 24 years as a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. But I was a young fighter pilot in World War II, and I was a captain in the Air Force near the end of the war. And we began receiving reports sometime in 1943 of Foo Fighters, fireball fighters. They were balls of brilliant light, sometimes brilliant green and sometimes brilliant orange light, sometimes the size of a basketball and sometimes much bigger, that would get in formation with our bombers and stay there. Nothing, you couldn't shoot them down. You couldn't, no matter what maneuver we went through, they stayed exactly in position. I had friends who reported these balls of fire appearing outside of the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, only 10 and 15 feet away, and they did every maneuver they could think of, dives and rolls and everything, trying to get rid of this ball of fire out there, and it remained in exactly the same position no matter what they did. This represented a technology far superior to anything that we had encountered anywhere on the planet before. We thought these objects were being manufactured by the German government because they were our opposition at the time, and we thought they had discovered some new technique because we had already experienced other instruments, other vehicles that passed through the bomber formations at very high speed that also had glowing tails. We had close approaches of disc-shaped craft, not as close as one would like, but following bomber formations. We knew that the rockets had been perfected, and we thought that most of these were simply a further extension of this rocket technology, and we believed that they were all being produced someplace by the Germans.
In the winter of 1942, a new light aircraft circled the Friel testing ground, the Friel 1. A single-seater with an overall length of 36 feet. In other words, the dimensions of a fighter aircraft, which was what the Friel was intended to be. This also holds true for the armaments. 3 30mm caliber Mk108s and 2 MG17s. While the Friel 1 was being developed and constructed, significant strides must have been made in the attempts to make transmedial contact. There were definite plans already at hand for the construction of a much larger aircraft, the Friel 7. In comparison to Friel technology, the Mita Beluzzo and Schreiber Habermold projects were really still quite conventional.
The hybrid use of this technology, some investigators believe, led to the development of the commonly recognized spacecraft known as the Beluzzo, the Schreiber, the Methe systems. The first, the second, and the third prototypes of which we see here represent the most commonly seen and observed spacecraft worldwide since 1947. The documentation and personal experiences with many of the German fuel experts, however, suggest that as early as 1935, the Germans were aware that there was life and technology in the universe, and were at least indirectly aware of the possibilities of building their own saucer craft, which would make them basically the first to have opened the window to contact with other areas of higher evolutionary intelligence. Unbeknownst to those involved in Operation Paperclip, there were other scientists involved in the development of very advanced systems, from the larger Honey Buell systems that were developed in 1939 42 and 45 that could carry literally scores of officers, to the Friel system, which is a very small vehicle, to a very large interplanetary electromagnetic spacecraft that was at least on the drawing boards, that had cabins for sleeping. We have a prospect of a vast system that made use of underground facilities for the preparation and launching of these most unique saucer craft that literally baffled the Americans and the British.
The SS, however, had a more audacious plan. There were, at least on paper, plans for a giant Haunebu spaceship with a diameter of over 400 feet. And if the reports are correct, there was even a 230-foot-long Haunebu 3. Just before the end of the Second World War, Department SSE-4 planned to build its own gigantic UFO space station. It was to have been assembled in the old Zeppelin hangars. Its name, the Andromeda Machine. Weights of more than 100 metric tons wouldn't have posed any difficulty to the Friel gravitational engine.
Where did the inspiration come? If we look back at the history of the ancient Near East, keeping in mind that the German philosophers were some of the best Orientalists, the work of Friedrich Delitzsch, who was one of the foremost Assyriologists. In his book, Bibel und Babel, the study of Babylon and the Bible, we acknowledge a reference to flying spacecraft. We have the same concepts in the Sanskrit traditions of the Vimana. The Germans were clearly well aware throughout the history of some 12 to 6,000 to 3,000 years, depending upon Oriental and Near Eastern history, that these craft did exist, and thus began in the 30s a very intensive effort to try to look at these exotic systems that could cross, as it were, the space barrier and open the window to contact with other worlds. It's this very unique scenario, the contact with other worlds, that is the most important part of the history of the Third Reich. For how does this type of experiment arrive on the scene? That is to say, the genetic experiments. How does this type of experiment arrive on the scene? That is to say, the ability to come up so quickly with such a vast category of different space systems of flight and navigation. How does this system of a global science, that is to say, that gives German experts the ability to make expeditions to Kashmir and to the South Pole, suddenly appear on the scene? Obviously, there are higher connections.
Many expeditions were mounted before and even during the war. Not just in the Near East, but also as far afield as South America, such as this one led by Edmund Kiss. And in the remotest regions of Asia, under the leadership of the famous Swedish explorer Sven Hedin. It was the search for traces of a higher knowledge.
The major impact of UFO technology did not occur in 1947 at Roswell, but rather earlier, by some 10 to 12 years, in the area of Germany. And on the basis of looking at documents and talking with former scientists who worked in Germany during the war, it is clear that many of the officers saw UFOs in the sky over Germany during World War II, and even in the region of Peenemünde, where the first experiments took place, there's clear evidence that there were advanced electronic eyes and ears that were watching very carefully the German scientific developments. Clearly and logically, Germany would be the most unique place for a contact that would be made by higher intelligence, since it was in the leadership of the scientific industry in the 20th century. Clearly, it was the place where some of the best scientific minds were assembled in the world.
What could this structure, photographed on the Friel testing ground in the autumn of 1943, possibly be? A Friel 7 engine being tested? Possibly.
Now, we know that in the early parts of the war, there were certain factions of the Allied forces that did not believe he had a secret weapon. And it wasn't until the Americans made much emphasis of this that they began to look at it seriously, and indeed did discover that Hitler not only had a secret weapon, he had what we would call today a UFO or spacecraft. He had one already off of the drawing board and flying, and it was capable of 1,200 miles an hour, vertical takeoff, 90-degree changes, and much like a helicopter, and of course was far superior to anything the Allied powers had at that time. Secondly, they knew that he had another craft about to be up and going. It was capable of doing 2,500 miles an hour, which was double the original. And not only did it have the characteristics of the original craft, but it also had a laser weapon aboard it that was capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor. Now, needless to say that that really spooked the Allied forces into making a redemptive attempt against him and bringing him into a state of capitulation.
What then became of all the secret projects carried out during the Third Reich? There are indeed a whole series of explanations. One is that the most important flying saucer was purposely sent to the bottom of Lake Mondsee in Upper Austria. Another is that they were concealed somewhere in South America and in the Antarctic. And not just that. Some people actually maintain that there is a German UFO base in the Antarctic, and that many were brought there disassembled by submarines. But why did the Allies under Admiral Byrd mount an invasion of the Antarctic?
I would like to say that among the many scenarios, of course, was the reality that there were some 30 missing German submarines that came from Baltic port areas at the close of World War II. These submarine systems had the Walter snorkel system, which allowed them to stay under water for weeks at a time. And this advanced technology made the German U-boats some of the finest in the world at that time, as acknowledged by U.S. naval documents. It is conceivable that some of this advanced technology could have been put on the submarines, spirited out, and with the snorkel system could have made for Argentinian ports and even the facilities there in Queen Madelon or Neues Schwabenland. I say this as a strong possibility, having seen the film that was made in 1947 with Admiral Byrd and Admiral Wood. I had the opportunity to actually see portions of this film, and what struck me was the fact that there was a significant military contingent that went down to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd. Why was it necessary to bring some 4,000 soldiers, a battleship, an aircraft carrier, and a support team to go into an area if it was purely a geological/geophysical exploration? Clearly there were other unknown factors there, and it was up to the Americans to see if they could acquire this missing technology. That is one scenario.
After a few days, however, and the loss of an undisclosed number of aircraft, the operation was abruptly terminated. What happened? What mysterious opponent could have repelled the Allied invasion so quickly and decisively? Could it have been the few remaining members of the German armed forces? Admiral Byrd later explained to the press that in the event of another war, the hard facts were that we would have to reckon with an attack from aircraft that could fly from pole to pole.
Later reports indicated that Admiral Byrd was given 8 months and unlimited funding to go in and pull this thing successfully off. But we also know that within 8 weeks he was totally defeated. Now, the supposition at that point was that there was an advanced civilization and technology, most probably alien. There were with the Third Reich and the SS who was in Antarctica, and that those great and developed technologies were used to defeat Admiral Byrd.
At the South Pole, it is clear that under the structures of ice, there are many layers of civilization, suggesting at one earlier point of time when the conditions of the South Pole were different. clearly there was some type of civilization there. This, of course, is assuming that the shell of the Earth had a different north and south magnetic pole. And with the shifting of the pole, this region became suddenly very, very frigid. And thus we do not see any evidences on the surface of these so-called earlier conditions of intelligence. However, I believe with the further exploration of the documents that both Admiral Byrd brought to the attention of the world after World War II, and the Brazilian Navy uncovered in 1961 with its subpole expedition, that extraterrestrial intelligence is also operated out of the area of the South Pole.
What was it that Admiral Byrd found on the South Pole? Incredibly enough, in an official American Navy documentary film, we found footage of what Admiral Byrd found on the South Pole. He found giant freshwater, never freezing lakes with areas around them that were free of any snow. And in that film we show footage of the Navy planes landing in these lakes. But even more so, he found, to his amazement, that his planes were disappearing very quickly. A lot of his planes were attacked by anti-gravity devices that were operated by the Germans there, by anti-gravity saucers. A lot of them crashed into invisible barriers and disintegrated in mid-flight. This is an indication that the Germans had already perfected the force field shields, and they were up and operational around the German colony at Neuschwabenland. And in an interview at Buenos Aires on his way back, Admiral Byrd made the incredible statement that the Third World War would probably be with an adversary coming from the polar regions of our planet, an adversary that has the ability to fly unobstructed from pole to pole. He was referring to the Germans at their South Polar colony at Neuschwabenland that were operating their anti-gravity craft with impunity and could fly circles around the globe, and of course would shoot out of the sky any of the attacking American planes.
It became the greatest secret of mankind. It started ufology as we know it today. Indeed, there is a second humanity, an inner terrestrial race who had already built cities in the inner earth before the sinking of Atlantis.